Good morning, men.
Good morning.
We've been going through 2 Samuel. We've been looking at the life of David. We saw an insurrection happen with his son. Absalom takes over, moves in, takes David's concubines, and we see that Absalom gets killed on the battlefield by Joab, even after David tells him to take it easy on his son. So Joab takes care of business and makes it happen. You see in chapter 19 that Joab now gives David the news, and he tells him, you need to snap out of it here, David. You need to stop mourning for your son and being all focused on yourself and your own emotions, and you need to think about somebody besides yourself. You have a kingdom to run. You have things to do, people to see, places to go. And you have to think of something more than your own pain. And that's what happens when you're a leader. You have to think less of your own stuff and more of other people's stuff. That's what a servant does. It's considering the needs of others more important than your own. So Joab reminds him of this. David finally returns to Jerusalem. We see that Shimei, who's a guy who was mocking him and throwing stones and kicking dust at him and mocking him, he comes back and he apologizes, and David forgives him, just flat out forgives him. He doesn't feel threatened by his cursing or by anything that he did. He says, I know that I'm the king of Israel. I don't need everybody to like me necessarily, but this guy apologizes, and David forgives him wholeheartedly. Mephibosheth shows up, and he hasn't taken care of his feet, or he hasn't combed his hair, he hasn't trimmed his mustache. He's basically been mourning the fact that David left, and he tells him the story of how his servant lied on him and how he didn't want to be a burden on David. And so David basically gives him back 50% of his lands. We talked about that, and we see Barzillai in verse 41 and on coming, and he was invited to come to Jerusalem to share in the bounty of taking the throne, and he actually hands over somebody else named Chimham. And so he says, well, listen, you don't have to bless me, but what about Chimham, probably his son? And so he passes it on. So David is then put into Jerusalem, and everything seems to be going well, but as you know, as life is, the battle is never over. So we're going to pick up the story in verse 40. It says, Now the king went on to Gilgal, and Chimham went with him. And all the people of Judah escorted the king, also half the people of Israel. Just then all the men of Israel came to the king and said to the king, Why have our brethren, the men of Judah, stolen you away and brought the king, his household, and all David's men with him across the Jordan? And so the men of Judah answered the men of Israel, Because the king is a close relative of ours. Why then are you angry over this matter? Have we ever eaten at the king's expense, or has he given us any gift? You see, what happens is the 10 tribes of Judah that actually sided with David's enemy were saying, hey, how come we weren't invited to the homecoming? How come we weren't invited to the parade? How come it is that only Judah, basically Judah and Benjamin, are escorting him back? And they said, well, because he's from the tribe of Judah and he's our close relative, and so that's why we're with the king. But these 10 tribes were kind of ostracized. They were kind of pushed out, and they weren't invited. You guys ever not invited to something and wonder why you weren't invited?
Yeah.
Somebody trying to tell you something, like a wedding or, So I want to invite you all to church on Sunday, just so that you don't feel slighted. Every one of you.
Even me?
Even you, especially you, Dad. So you see that there's this division between the 10 tribes and Judah, which basically is Judah and Benjamin. And there's this early split. Now you're going to see later on the tribes split into what's called Judah and Israel. Israel then being the 10 tribes, and then Judah being Judah and Benjamin. So you start to see this separation early on. So it's not something that just happens, after Solomon. It's something that has been brewing, and it begins actually before here, but we see it here. So you can kind of see divisions before they become big deals. And if you take care of them when they're in the, like the fire in the wilderness, if you take care of it when it's small, it won't take and burn through everything. And so these guys have got some bitterness, and the way the people of Judah figure they're going to solve this is through an argument. And the men of Israel answered the men of Judah and said, "We have 10 shares in the king, therefore we also have more right to David than you." You can almost picture David in between these two groups like a tug of war. "Why then do you despise us? Were we not the first to advise bringing back our king? Yet the words of the men of Judah were fiercer than the words of the men of Israel." So you have these two groups that are fighting. And they say, "Well, how come we weren't invited?" And they say, "Well, because, quite frankly, you turned against the king anyway." But they're not being honest. They're saying, "Well, because he's a close relative of ours. That's why we didn't invite you." You ever give somebody an excuse that's not really the excuse? There's an excuse beneath the excuse.
Yes. Avoid the truth.
I hear this all the time. I don't know about you, but people don't normally want to just flat out tell you the truth. So they tell you something they think you can digest.
Yeah.
That's like trying to cover up a pile of dog poop with dust. It's still gonna stink, so. And that's what's going on here. You see, there's a schism that's begun, and instead of dealing with it and speaking honestly, they figure whoever argues loudest wins. You ever try that?
Yeah.
Nobody wins. You get louder, and then they get louder, and then you get louder, and whoever is the loudest wins. And apparently that's how they decided this little argument. The men of Judah, their words were fiercer. That's no way to solve an issue, is it? You get yourself in a lot of trouble that way.
Make it worse.
So, they say we weren't invited, and they feel slighted. And so they get loud, and nobody wins. Verse 20, or chapter 20 rather, sorry. "And there happened to be there a rebel whose name was Sheba." Everybody go, ooh. "The son of Bichri, a Benjamite. He blew a trumpet, and he said," by the way, beware of people that blow a trumpet. Anybody that makes an announcement, be careful of the announcement, because not everything that you hear is truth. Any of you surf the internet? Just because it's on the internet doesn't mean it's true. Just because somebody has a platform to speak doesn't necessarily mean you're speaking the truth. So here it comes after the trumpet blast. "We have no share in David, nor do we have inheritance in the son of Jesse. Every man to his tents, O Israel." So just as David's getting back on the throne, you got a guy who's a usurper. And he says, "We're not going to follow David." But notice it was after this fierce argument where we're going to try to out-volume one another or out-posture one another. Suddenly there's a guy who squirts out like a wet watermelon seed between your fingers, who sounds a trumpet, and suddenly he's on the ball, and he's a rebel, and he's gathering people to his side. Again, didn't get a chance to even settle down from the previous war. So every man of Israel deserted David. Does it surprise you that people are so fickle?
No.
Does it surprise you that people are saying, "David's our king, he's back at..." No, we're against David. Doesn't it surprise you how fickle people are? It only took a week before the people that were welcoming Jesus in on Palm Sunday said, "Crucify him, crucify him." The only one you can trust is the Lord, man, right?
In the NIV edition says, every man to his tent, O Israel. What is it?
That means don't follow David, don't be here for the parade, don't welcome him back. Just go about your business, go home. Just get out of here, go home.
I guess I read it too
It's a euphemism. It's like saying we're out of here.
Okay.
Yeah. What do you mean you're out of here? What do you mean you're out of here? That doesn't make any sense. You can't leave here. Here, wherever you go, there you are. So if you take everything serious, but it's a euphemism. It's a figure of speech. So every man to his tent means what it says in Judges is every man did what was right in his own eyes.
Okay.
So that was verse 1. And so every man of Israel deserted David and followed Sheba, the son of Berchri. But the men of Judah, from the Jordan as far as Jerusalem, remained loyal to their king. So you see, there's a separation. And because they thought they would solve it with an argument and being louder, they didn't solve anything. In fact, there was another problem that got created out of that. And so that's never the way to resolve something. Just because you're louder doesn't mean someone will hear you. Which is why we get louder.
Yeah.
Have you never noticed that?
Yeah.
You explain something to somebody and they don't get it and you say, okay. And if you're like me, you get slow. I don't like what you did. Did you get that time? And then you get sarcastic. And then you step it up. I'm just telling you some of the stupid ways in which I have reacted.
Yes.
So because of this argument, now this one guy rises up and he's a rebel and people are going to follow him because they've got they got an axe to grind. Now David came to his house at Jerusalem, and the king took the 10 women, his concubines, whom he had left to keep the house, and he put them in seclusion and supported them, but did not go into them. That is also a euphemism, but it is literal. And so they were shut up to the day of their death, living in widowhood.
Why is that even in there?
Yeah, why?
What do we need to know that for?
Well, these concubines, if you remember, David left them behind to kind of water the plants, take care of the dogs, whatever, take care of the throne. And his son, Absalom, went and had sex with every one of them up on the roof openly. They built a tent for him up there so he wouldn't get sunburned. And he just had his way with these women. And now, how is David going to come to these women and take them again as a girlfriend? They've been soiled. Somebody else has been with them, his own son. So this is something that should not be done. In fact, he shouldn't even be having girlfriends that are just live-in girlfriends you can just have sex with and casually. This is something that's not supposed to be happening. So what do? You get home and you say, hey, my son had his way with you. I have no need for you guys anymore. Go home to your father's house. Well, how do you do that? You've been shamed. You've been raped. You've got post-traumatic stress disorder, whatever it is. And what's he going to do? Shovel them out the door and say, there's the door, see you later? I mean, they stayed because he told them to stay.
Yeah, he took care of it.
And what he did is he took care of them all their lives, but they weren't going to get married to anybody, and he certainly wasn't going to have his way with them anymore, because as far as he was concerned, they were soiled. It's a sad story.
So sad, they never had sex again. So sad.
Well, he never went into them again. And the funny thing is, from this time forward, he doesn't take on any more concubines. He doesn't take on any more wives. We saw up to this point, he's just been kind of amassing women.
Yeah.
He's been adding, I know he has at least 7 wives, and he's got these concubines. They're live-in girlfriends.
How old is he in this part of the
He's probably over 50, like you did.
David's a hero, isn't he?
But see, he's going to do the right thing by them by taking care of them, and he's not going to, flush them out of his house and say, listen, you're damaged to me, so I got no use for you. He takes care of them until the day of their death. In other words, he's faithful to watch over them and give them a place to stay and food, and they have prestige being in the king's house, and they probably have his ear, So he does that, but there's nobody that's going to marry them now because they're known as.
They're actually declared widows because of their relations to Absalom with Dad.
Well, it was widowhood because there was nobody that they were fit to marry, really. So they stayed single all of their days. So that's how David handles that. So you see this whole mess that occurs. There are all these loose ends that David's tying up, and this is one of the loose ends. Is what do you do with these 10 girlfriends in your house that have been raped by your son? You very well, in good conscience, can't, have relationships with them. So, verse 4, David went from loving to loathing. And it's interesting because his son does that, right? His son that was all lustful for his sister. He has his way with his sister, and then he hated her, and he hated her more than he loved her. And then he was burning with lust for her. It's a very funny thing when people finally get what they want. They shut down and it turns to hate. Verse 4, and the king said to Amasa, now you remember who Amasa is, right? He's his new general, took over for Joab. He actually was Absalom's general. And so what he does, because Joab ended up turning his son into a pincushion, is he relieves Joab of his position, and in order to make peace, he takes Amasa, who was the general of Absalom, and makes him his general. And he says, you're going to be my number one. But you always have to be careful when you're number one, because you could become number two very quickly. And I mean that in the euphemistic sense.
Is that documented that he released Joab and made Amasa?
Yes. Yeah, we talked.
In this stuff, right?
No, we talked about that last week. So he's already in place. So he says here, and the king said to Amasa, assemble the men of Judah for me within 3 days, and be present here yourself. So Amasa went to assemble the men of Judah, but he delayed longer than the set time which David had appointed to him. So here's the general. He says, General, get the guys together in 3 days, report back to me, let's get ready to go get this rebel, Sheba, who has taken all the men of Israel with him. And David said to Abishai, now Sheba, the son of Berchri, will do us more harm than Absalom, because he didn't do what David told him to do. He said, I want you to do this in 3 days. We got to jump on this quickly. We can't let this rebellion get out of hand like we did with Absalom. So I've learned my lesson. We're not going to let this continue. I'm going to nip this in the bud. Take the Lord's servants and pursue him, lest he find himself fortified cities and escape us. So we need to get on his butt right away. So Joab's men, with the Cherethites and the Pelethites, and all the mighty men, went out after him. And they went out of Jerusalem to pursue Sheba, the son of Berchri. So if plan A doesn't work, your top general, who you told get the men ready in 3 days, if he doesn't react and in 3 days he still doesn't have his act together, what do? You go to people that you know will get things done. So he goes to Abishai, who is in close league with Joab, and they get all the men, these mighty men, these guys that have been traveling with David for a long time, and they assemble and they rush out, kind of like the Marines, if you will. And they were at the large stone which is in Gibeon. Amasa came before them. So Amasa's kind of picking up the rear, and he shows up a little bit later on their heels. And now Joab was dressed in battle armor, and there was a belt with a sword fastened in its sheath at his hips. And he was going forward, and it fell out. Now this is an experienced man of battle, and he's all dressed, he's ready to do battle, he's ready to go head to head with anybody. And he's got his sword around his waist, and he's got it sheathed, and it turns over that he bends over and his sword falls out of his sheath. I don't know about you in the military, if that ever happened, if you didn't treat your weapon with the ultimate respect, you were humiliated and shamed. So his sword falls out, which is unbecoming of somebody who's a trained general, right? Then Joab said to Amasa, "Are you in health, my brother?" So Joab took Amasa by the beard with his right hand to kiss him, but Amasa did not notice the sword that was in Joab's hand. And he struck him with it in the stomach, and his entrails poured out on the ground. And he did not strike him again.
Nor did he.
Thus he died.
Joab could have stabbed him. He got Absalom too. Hanging in a tree.
Joab says, "Hey, how you doing, brother?" And he bends over and his sword falls out, and he goes to pick it up and he grabs the guy by the beard and he runs him through with the sword. Be careful.
Pastor Dave,
Just do as you're told is what it's telling you.
he's
He told
in
him to do it
Joe,
3 days and he didn't do it.
he's
She wasn't
in
happy.
Joab's place.
That's correct. He's the general.
She wasn't
It
happy.
it appears, I don't know what version this is, probably King James. It appears he's wearing Joab's equipment, including his sword. And it falls out of the fifth.
Well, it explains Joab is dressed in armor, and it's Joab who has this sword. I don't know if there's any confusion. It seems, it says here, now Joab was dressed in battle armor.
It says, Amasa went before them, and Joab's garment that he had put on was girded unto him, and up on the girdle with a sword fastened on his loins.
What version is that?
King James.
Okay, I'm looking at the New King James. And it says, now Joab was dressed in battle armor, and it was a belt with a sword fastened in its sheath at his hips. And as he was going, it fell out. So I don't know that it makes a big deal who's wearing the thing, but here it says that Joab is wearing the armor, and there's a sword, and the sword slips out. I find it amazing that sometimes when people smile in your face, they have a sword ready for you. It should never be the case. And yet we live in that kind of society, don't we, where people will smile in your face and then they'll stab you in the back. At least Joab stabbed him in the front.
Was it jealousy because he was replaced?
Absolutely.
Yeah, he was right.
Where was the honor, though, in killing him that way? I mean, you know,
He continues to violate the king.
it was very sneaky.
And ask him before he does it, how you feeling?
Did he feel like he couldn't take him straight up in a fight?
He didn't think he was worthy of a fight. He just wanted to take him out. Simple. I don't know if any of you ever fought on the street, but what you want to do is take somebody out real quick. Because you don't want to risk any damage to yourself. You don't even want to exert yourself if you don't have to, right?
But that was a Judas move, 100%.
Oh, absolutely. There are people that do that all the time. They'll smile on your face and then they'll stab you.
There's a song like that.
Happens all the time.
Do you think from maybe a moment that Joab was being a patriarch?
Being what?
A patriarch?
A patriarch? Explain.
Well, he knew that, this other general was delayed for some reason, and he had to go out in front of them. So he was intentionally, disobeying David's orders, which means, this guy's got to go. So Joab stepped up to the plate and said, you got to get out of the way because, you're interfering with the plan of the king.
Well, knowing what I know about the character of Joab from what I read, and seeing the absence of David giving an order to take his life, I don't think that's the case. I mean, it could be, but I don't think so.
But his character, goes to the same because he turned around and killed David's son after David told him to take care of him. So.
Well, Joab kills lots of people.
He's ruthless.
Joab was the one who was responsible for the Hittite. If you remember, he was given orders and said, push the battle up to the front, and then when in the heat of the battle, make sure that Uriah is in the hardest part and withdraw.
Right.
And that's what Joab does. So Joab has no problem. He kills Ishbosheth. He kills Absalom. He kills a bunch of people. This is what he does.
He does the dirty work.
But he killed them. But he killed Absalom, and his motivation was for David. That's
Correct.
how I thought.
But David didn't like
Now it's a
that.
matter of jealousy here.
I think so. I think he wants his old job back. And so he takes this guy who once was the enemy general of David and of Joab. He was Joab's, adversary, absolutely. And so now this guy is alongside, cozied up to David. Maybe David did it to try to make peace. Maybe he did it to relieve Joab of his position because of what he did to Absalom, because he's got to have some kind of reaction. He can't just let that go on. And Joab takes things into his own hands, literally, and he takes care of Amasa. So beware of smiles sometimes in your face, because there might be a sword. So he says, "Are you in health, brother?" And Joab took Amasa by the beard and the right hand to kiss him. Amasa did not notice the sword in his hand. Do you know when people have a beef with you?
Not always.
Look for it. Look for it. And don't run away from it or ignore it. Make sure you deal with it, because it'll come back to bite you at some point. He says he did not notice the sword in Joab's hand. He should have. And he should have known to be careful walking up to Joab with such a greeting. "Hello, my brother, are you well? Are you in good health?" Well, not for long, he's not. And he struck him in the stomach, and his entrails poured out in the ground. That's intestines, by the way, guys. So they tend to unfold when pressure is released. And he did not strike him again. In other words, he did a really good job of running him through. And this is how he died, or thus he died. Now, he didn't die right away. Then Joab and Abishai, his brother, pursued Sheba. Now that they got this guy out of the way, there's no question as to who's in charge. Sheba, the son of Berchri. Meanwhile, one of Joab's men stood near Amasa and said, "Whoever favors Joab and whoever is for David, follow Joab." I'm sorry. I expect you guys to make comments, and you don't. Here. They said, "Listen, they're standing by this guy who's laying on the ground, probably moaning and groaning and holding his intestines in his hands as he's dying, and say, 'Anybody that's for David has to be for Joab.'" I don't know. It's kind of difficult because you have to kind of take one with the other now. It's like when someone asks you, "Have you stopped beating your wife?" Because there's no good answer.
Yeah.
If I say, "Yeah, I've stopped beating my wife," that means I beat my wife. If I say no, that means I'm still beating my wife. It's like no matter what, you're going to have a wrong answer. Do these pants make my butt look fat? There's no right answer. There's no right answer sometimes. And see, what they did is they took Joab and they took David and linked them together and said, if you're for David, you got to be for Joab. That's like if you guys serve Jesus Christ, you have to be going to Grace Bible Fellowship.
Amen.
No, there's a real problem there. Because I'm not Jesus Christ. See, the problem is, now you've linked these two together. It's like, I really love my job, but I hate my boss. And guess what? If you want to stay in this company, you got to stay with the boss. That's the way it is, unless you take the boss out, which you don't want to go up against Joab if he's your boss. So this guy makes this giant statement trying to consolidate power under David. I mean, what happens if you love David but you hate Joab? Well, I guess you got to do what you got to do.
Who is this guy? Who's the guy who stood up and said?
Just some guy.
Just some guy.
Just some guy. Everybody's blowing trumpets and saying things. Everybody's on Facebook making things.
Who knows where his head was at?
What's that?
Who knows where his head was at?
Have no idea. He's trying to consolidate power, and he says, if you're for David, you're for Joab too. Let's follow Joab. He's trying to get everybody that was with Amasa and following Amasa as the general, as the king's man, to follow Joab. He's trying to sway public opinion.
Look at the guy in the crowd.
Yeah, or become like this guy. Right. But Amasa wallowed in his blood in the middle of the highway. You see, he's not dead yet. Don't throw him on the cart just yet.
And I thought he was giving him a quick death. He was not. He was not. He gave him a short kind of a suffering.
Yep.
He
You come up
really
against me, this is what you get.
Did not like this guy.
I mean, I think about Ishbosheth, he hits him with the back of his spear. Boom! And it goes right through him.
I remember that.
Yeah, so I mean,
He was Sammy the Bull. This guy was very.
yeah. Good round,
That
yeah.
was a killer.
So when the man saw that all the people stood still, he moved Amasa from the highway to the field, and he threw a garment over him. When he saw that everyone who came upon him halted. So he says, this guy is a roadblock. And all of these men that were just serving him are now coming upon him and looking down on his body going, what do we do now? When they removed him from the highway, all the people went after Joab to pursue Sheba, the son of Berchri. So they had to get him out of the way, literally. And he went through all the tribes of Israel to Abel and Beth-Makkah and all of the Berites. And so they were gathered together and also went after Sheba. Then they came and besieged him in Abel at Beth-Makkah, and they cast up a siege mound against the city, and it stood by the rampart. And all the people who were with Joab battered the wall to throw it down. So they finally got him cornered. He's in the city of Abel. And so they build a mound. If you know anything about the way they did warfare, they would actually just keep bringing like giant buckets of debris and just start mounding up a mound so they could get over the wall. So instead of a scaffolding or instead of a ladder or anything, they just keep bringing dirt, bringing debris, with a shield up over your head so that the people don't throw stuff on you or shoot at you. And you just keep building and building and building, or trying to knock the wall down. You take some heavy implement and start knocking at the stones on the wall. So it looks like they're going to continue to do this for a long period of time. So they've got him cornered. Then a wise woman cried out from the city, "Here, here! Please say to Joab, come nearby that I may speak with you." And when he had come near to her, the woman said, "Are you Joab?" He said, "I am." "Did you check my name tag?" And then she said to him, "Hear the words of your maidservant." First of all, she takes a humble stance. She calls herself his maidservant. And he answered, "I'm listening." And so she spoke, saying, "They used to talk in former times, saying, they shall surely seek guidance in Abel." In other words, this town was known for counseling and being able to solve problems. Maybe it was known as the local UN or something. And so they would end disputes. "I am among the peaceable and faithful in Israel. You seek to destroy a city and a mother in Israel. Why would you swallow up the inheritance of the Lord?" She says, you're coming against this city and you're about to destroy God's inheritance. You see, this city belongs to the Lord. And you're destroying the Lord's stuff. And a mother, which is me, who's speaking to you. Now, I don't know about you, but she's trying to pull some heartstrings here. You're going to let this old gray hair of a mother go down in misery? I don't know if you've ever had mother-in-law guilt thrown at you, or mother guilt at you.
Stop.
"Hey, I'm going to go out tonight. I'm going to be out till midnight." "Oh, why would you do this to your poor mother?" You've never gotten mother guilt? You guys. Anyway, they're supposed to offer peace. If somebody in the city, in Deuteronomy 20:11, it says that you're to offer peace. If somebody comes out and says they want to stop fighting, you're to offer peace and you're to entertain that. And so she here is offering peace, a peaceful, at least conversation. And so Joab should do such a thing, right? And Joab answered and said, far be it from me that I should swallow up or destroy." Yeah, that's what I said. Far be it from Joab to swallow up or destroy anyone. He's just the very milk of human kindness. That is not so. But a man from the mountains of Ephraim, Sheba, the son of Bichri, by name, has raised his hand against the king, against David. Deliver him only, and I will depart from the city. Well, that sounds like a good deal, right? So the woman said to Joab, watch, his head will be thrown over to you over the wall.
That's like John Gotti's wife right there, man, huh?
Then the woman in her wisdom went to all the people, and they cut off the head of Sheba, the son of Bichri, and they threw it out to Joab. And he blew a trumpet, and they withdrew from the city, every man to his tent. So Joab returned to the king at Jerusalem.
Maybe she should have had Joab's job, huh? She got stuff done real quick.
Well, here's the thing. She made peace, right? She made peace with him so that the city didn't get destroyed and all the people get... I mean, if you resist this guy and he comes into your city by force, you're toast. But if you go to him and say, listen, what can I do? How can I make peace with you? Oh, you're looking for this guy Sheba? No problem. I'll have it taken care of for you.
Exactly.
And like a soccer ball, his head comes rolling up over the, and hits the ground, boom, boom, with a thud. And he's like, okay, guys, we're done here. Let's go home. They might title this "How to Get Ahead in Israel."
She's tough.
Corny but funny.
For Sheba, if in your effort to get ahead, be careful you don't lose yours. In an effort to get ahead, be careful you don't lose yours.
So now she just went into the people of town and said, listen, this guy went against David, so we got to take him out.
That's right, or the whole city's going to get destroyed. And they're like,
All right, we'll take
one man dying for the city? Yeah, I could do that.
Yeah. Makes sense.
It's the same thing that Caiaphas reasons about Jesus. He says, isn't it a better thing that one person die for the nation? And he was prophesying about Jesus dying for the nation of Israel.
No.
It's a rather interesting thing. And so you can see Jesus on every page if you look at it. And so his head comes up over the side, and that squelches that. Because once the leader is gone, once the head of the insurrection is gone, the insurrection dies. And so Joab was over all the army of Israel. He got his old job back. Benaniah, the son of Jehoiada, was over the Cherethites and the Pelethites. Adoram was in charge of revenue, so he was the treasurer. Jehoshaphat, the son of Ahilud, was recorder, so he was the guy writing everything down. He was the secretary. Shiva was scribe. Zadok and Abiathar were the priests, and Ira, the Jairite, was the chief minister under David. So we're given all of the captains, all of the people who were in charge in the government when David was put back in charge. Chapter 21 to 24 is kind of an appendix. We've been reading through the book in kind of a sequential order. Now you're going to see a bunch of stories that kind of get added to the end of the book because we're almost done with 2 Samuel. So you're going to see things that flash back to other things that have happened. And so you might be a little confused when you read through. You're like, wait a minute, I thought this already happened. What's going on? David's old and he's already in the throne, and he's over, his throne has been established, his son is gone. And so you think about all that, and then you read through here and you go, wait a minute, this doesn't seem right. So this is kind of like the end of David's days, and they're like, oh yeah, I forgot to tell you this one story. And so they get put in here from 21 to 24, just so that you know. Chapter 21. Now there was a famine in the days of David for 3 years, year after year. And David inquired of the Lord, and the Lord answered, it is because of Saul and his bloodthirsty house, because he killed the Gibeonites. If you remember what Saul did, he made an agreement with them, and then he broke that agreement, and he killed a bunch of them. This is back early in David's reign, when he's coming on the foot of Saul's reign. So this is something that happened 40 years earlier, by the way. So if you're looking for a timeline, this takes us back about 40 years. And so the king called the Gibeonites and spoke with them. And now the Gibeonites were not of the children of Israel, but of the remnant of the Amorites. Now these were the enemies of Israel. And yet there was a treaty that was made, and the treaty was broken by Saul. And the children of Israel had sworn protection to them, but Saul had sought to kill them in his zeal for the children of Israel and Judah, because his word didn't mean much. Therefore David said to the Gibeonites, "What shall I do for you? And with what shall I make atonement that you may bless the inheritance of the Lord?" So he goes to the Gibeonites and say, "Listen, I realize that God has caused this famine to come upon our nation because of this injustice that was done, and it's payback. What can I do to make this right?" This is a good effort to make peace. It's funny that this story of making peace is right on the tails of this other woman trying to make peace. It may have been the thing that triggered in the mind the writer to put this in as the appendix. And the Gibeonites said to him, "We will have no silver or gold from Saul or from his house, nor shall you kill any man in Israel for us." That's very gracious. They're willing to forgive, right? They're willing to let it go. And so he said, "Whatever you say, I will do for you." And then they answered the king, "As for the man who consumed us and plotted against us, that we should be destroyed from remaining in any of the territories of Israel, let 7 men of his descendants be delivered to us, and we will hang them before the Lord in Gibeah of Saul, whom the Lord chose." These are his descendants, the descendants of Saul. These are going to be his grandchildren. And his grandchildren are going to suffer for something he did. How do you feel about that? How would you like your grandchildren to suffer for your sins?
It's a bad deal. It's a bad deal.
I don't know about you, but that's a prayer for me. I pray that my kids don't suffer from my sins. I pray that my grandkids don't suffer from my sins or their sins.
This generation is still.
It is. Men, we don't realize how our actions affect our family and how that will affect your grandchildren. So we have to be careful what we do, because it will roll down. Like a $1.9 trillion loan to yourself to just give away to people. Do you think that will have ramifications on the economy and the next generation? Do you think our national debt will have something to do with the welfare of your children and grandchildren? It absolutely will. Unless the Lord comes. Unless the Lord comes back. I went to buy a piece of plywood for $54. Cost $18 last time I went.
$400 in materials for me.
4x4x12.
For a hole in the deck that was 10 by 2.
Spending money to keep everybody happy
Printing money.
doesn't make anyone happy. So, this political message has been brought to you by accident. So there are side effects from what we do, men, and we have to be careful, because it does get handed down to our family. And the king said, "I will give them." And the king spared Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, because of the Lord's oath that was between them, between David and Jonathan, the son of Saul. So the king took Armoni and Mephibosheth, different Mephibosheth, by the way. Yes, there's more than one person with that name. The 2 sons of Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, whom she bore to Saul, and the 5 sons of Michal, the daughter of Saul, whom she brought up for Adriel, the son of Barzillai, the Maholathite. In other words, they weren't her natural children. These were kind of the children she brought up as her own. And he delivered them into the hands of the Gibeonites, and they hanged them on the hill before the Lord. And so they fell, all 7 together, and they were put to death in the days of the harvest, in the first days, in the beginning of the barley harvest. It's a very disheartening thing to hear that the lives of those who were innocent had to die for the guilty.
This is the same daughter that was promised to David.
Yes,
Oh, wow.
but she didn't have any natural children. She had some children that she was bringing up, but they weren't her natural born children. You're right, these are the descendants of Saul.
And
Now-
they didn't care it was women in this case either, which is unusual. Like, usually it's men they want to take out,
Oh, well, these were 7 men. They didn't take any of the women. These are the 5 sons that she brought up. So it wasn't her that they sacrificed, it was
no?
these guys.
Okay.
Yeah. So, now Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, took sackcloth and spread it for herself on a rock. From the beginning of the harvest until the late rains poured on them from heaven. By the way, that's about 6 months.
Okay.
From very early spring until the harvest. And she did not allow the birds of the air to rest on them by day, nor the beasts of the field by night. And David was told that Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, the concubine of Saul, had done. And David went and took the bones of Saul and the bones of Jonathan his son from the men of Jabesh Gilead, who had stolen them from the street of Bethshan, where the Philistines had hung them up, after the Philistines had struck down Saul at Gilboa. And so he brought up the bones of Saul and the bones of Jonathan his son there, and they gathered the bones of those who had been hanged. They buried the bones of Saul and Jonathan his son in the country of Benjamin of Zelah, in the tomb of Kish his father. So they performed all that the king commanded, and after that God heeded the prayer for the land. So there was a payment that had to be paid, and there was innocent blood that had to be shed because of something that Saul did. He didn't keep his word, and the grandchildren suffered. We think about the innocent dying for the guilty as an abhorrent thing, and yet we can do that by handing our sin down to our family. And we can have children who are completely innocent learning things that they should not learn, knowing things that they should not know, diving into things that they should not dive into because of us, because of our exposure. Pray that God preserves us from such a thing. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your word, which is so clear about how the best thing that we can do is to serve you with our whole heart. I pray that you help us not to hold bitterness in our heart like Joab did. We don't seek positions of power. We don't seek to undermine those who are in authority. I pray that you help us, Lord, to serve you. And like Moses was the most humble man on the face of the planet of his time, that we might do as well. To look to you, Lord, and trust for you to bring justice and judgment, that we would not seek to do it on our own. I pray that you help us, Lord, to live for you 100%, that we would escape from making the mistakes that we would otherwise make. Protect us, Lord, from temptation. Strengthen us so that we might be able to battle it. And help us never to give up the battle or to think that it's over. I pray that you help us, Lord, to be committed to you. And Lord Jesus, we thank you for your example of sacrificing yourself for us,
Yes.
something we don't deserve. And you were innocent. I pray that you help us, Lord, to walk in your footsteps.
Yes.
In Jesus' name, amen.